I'm going to just review the actual contract at the end of my slides,
Okay.
just kind of see it as a whole. Um, but we'll get started in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
Um, yeah, what I'm doing today under the responsibilities of buyer agency is just to pull out um, the important things that we actually could be liable for if we don't perform. So that's the key thing.
Well,
Yeah, it's
a
12.
little bit. Yeah.
I'll get started.
Yeah. All right.
So as I said, as I said, buyer agency is now pretty much the norm. Um, in my experience, I've gone through periods of real estate where we didn't have buyer agency. Nobody knew what they were talking about with buyer agency. And then we all found out that we were breaking the law and not doing it correctly. And then there was this huge movement to try to get all the real estate agents and all the buying public to understand what buyer agency really meant. The complication was Chicago, our close neighbor and large real estate market, never really picked up on the importance of buyer agency. They just had assumed buyer agency. If you were working with a buyer, you were going to represent the buyer. If you were working with a seller, you're going to represent the seller. And they really had no paperwork or signature or contract to clarify. Uh, Today, they're still kind of behind the wall on it, but the lawsuit made them clarify exactly what buyer agency is, and they do now have to have a signed agreement. Um, so I'm talking to agents today where the majority of agents have no problem asking or talking about buyer agency with a new buyer. Hopefully, it's during a buyer consultation where you have time to really explain the benefits and the services that are offered in buyer agency. It is required to explain that choice before you get started. And today, where we have that pre-agency showing agreement, there is a choice of working with that while showing properties or actually signing up for buyer agency from the beginning. But the requirement is you must show them um, the choice that they have. If you are at an open house representing your own listing, you do not need a showing agreement or a buyer agency agreement with a buyer who's interested because you are representing the seller. So you are uh, actually in a position to work with that buyer as a customer and not a client. If that buyer at the open house wants to write an offer and wants representation, that is where designated agency comes in. We'll get to that in a little bit. So, but the obvious other choice is to work with them, to continue to work with them, but as a customer. So they don't get the services or the representation of buyer agency. So that clarified, that explained is your job during the buyer agents, the buyer consultation up front. A lot of buyers, especially if they're coming from Chicago, a lot of buyers assume they're being represented by the agent. Of course, you're representing me. You're not going to represent the seller. And I've even had some buyers in the past be irritated by that notion. But now, as I say, with buyer agencies so well received, we don't have that kind of argument anymore. But having buyer agency gives you the freedom to use your negotiating skills and your real estate statistic information. You can obviously show them the analysis of pricing, show them the analysis of resale possibilities, show them the pluses and the negatives of a property while you're looking at them. You can build a better business relationship with them. I say it just, as I said, that freedom of being able to do your job is really what being a buyer agent is. You get to maintain your natural relationship with your family and friends, obviously. It's good for first-time buyers because you're going to be doing a lot of consultation. Your sellers who are now buying, you worked with them on their listing and now they're buying something. You have a special relationship with them. You should be working with them as a buyer's agent. Past clients, relocation, some relocation services require buyer agents to work with their clients. You can be held liable if you give customer agent representation when you are a sub-agent of the seller listing brokerage. So today we're talking about buyer agency responsibilities. A lot of that is to keep you out of a liable situation. Because if you don't perform on the services that the buyer agency requires, they can sue you. And Keller Williams. Okay. How is it introduced? When is it introduced? Well, prior to a showing, or if you're going to use the showing agreement, you can delay it to see if you two get along pretty much. So you can use the showing agreement, which is pre-agency, or you can actually get a buyer agency agreement before you show properties. But buyer consultation is the time to emphasize the important. That's before you're showing them anything. The value of arm's length positioning, that's what an agent is. That's what a sports agent is. That's what a movie star agent is. That's their role, is arm's length positioning. And that's the value of more than direct negotiation. It's very hard for a person who lives in a house to negotiate the best deal with a buyer. It's better to have that arm's length positioning. And that's what an agent does. What are above and beyond expectations of the duties owed to the buyer? Compensation to the buyer's agent firm is transparent and negotiable. That was the soul of the lawsuit that we went through last August. We have to make sure that the buyer understands that the commission that you earn, the commission that is paid to the commission that is paid in the transaction is negotiable. So whether you're charging a buyer agency fee is also negotiable. Okay, next. So having a buyer or seller as a client, when you get into a listing contract or you're into a buyer agency agreement, that person, the buyer or the seller, is known as a client. And the big distinction, and make sure you use the vocabulary correctly. You call a client, you call a customer, and not to cross them. As soon as that agreement or contract is signed, the firm, Keller Williams, and you as a KW agent are in a fiduciary contract. And you hear that sometimes on commercials on TV about a fiduciary contract. That means that the firm and the clients of that firm owe the client the duty to put the client's interests above, first and above the agent and the firm's interests. So you cannot, in a listing or in a buyer agency agreement, sort of try to construct the contract or the transaction so that you get a better deal, you get a better commission, you get something that you want over the interests of your client. That is against what a fiduciary contract is. And that's what we have in a buyer agency agreement and in a listing agreement. So remember that word. Okay. This is a list that I created years ago, but I still think it has value because it talks about other services that you as a buyer's agent are responsible for. So in this chart, you can see what a sub-agent would do. Somebody's working with somebody as a customer, or what a buyer's agent can do. And as you can see from the checklists on the right, there are many more services that a buyer's agent can do that a sub-agent cannot, or working with a customer cannot do. So they can both arrange property showings, assist with financing, provide property data, explain forms and agreement, monitor the closing, and prepare the property value study or a CMA. You can, with a customer, provide a CMA. But then it goes beyond. As a client, you work with access to the entire market, listed and for sale by owner, unless you exclude it in the contract. If in the agreement, write letters to owners who may be interested in the sale. Writing letters to all the homes in a 2-block area or something that the buyer really wants, and just seeing. You can do that as a buyer's agent. You cannot do that if you're working with a customer. You can promote and protect the buyer's best interest, advise the buyer in the terms of the offer. What does that offer really mean? What do those words mean to the buyer? Not so much working with the customer. I highlighted in red, negotiate. Negotiate the best price and terms for the buyer, have strategies. You are going in the boxing ring against the listing agent to negotiate the best deal for your client, or a win-win situation for both buyer and seller. But I believe negotiation is your best skill, your value skill, and one that you should constantly be trying to hone. You can point out reasons not to buy. You can point out reasons that you think the price is too high. You can explain the pros and cons of an appraisal contingency, the right to cure, title issues, testing, financing contingencies in the offer to purchase. You cannot really do that with a customer. Customer, you're just basically saying, here's the contract, read it, tell me what you want to pay for this, and sign it. Suggest use of addendum O and addendum R to clarify the offer to purchase if occupancy or rental terms are important. Pull these things out. Use all the facilities and all of the contracts and all of the help that we have available to you. You really are obligated to go to the municipality or check with them online on current news issues with the property. Make sure that you understand that. Don't be caught blind at the end and find out that there's an easement over that property that you didn't know about or something like that. But both with a customer and a client, follow through on all terms and dates. Keep the buyer's position confidential. We are one of a few states that offer confidentiality to both a client and a customer. Okay. So all clients and customers are obligated to get these duties. These are duties that they should expect, they should read, and they should receive. Provide broker services fairly and honestly, exercise reasonable skill and care in providing brokerage services, provide accurate information about market conditions, disclose in writing material adverse facts. That's a requirement. Protect confidentiality, duty to safeguard trust funds. Let me read that again. It is your duty to safeguard trust funds. Present contracts in an objective and unbiased manner and disclose advantages and disadvantages of the proposal. So you can give this to a customer and you can give these services to a client. But then the next slide talks about the ones that are exclusively just for your client, not given to a customer. Provide information and advice on real estate matters that affect the transaction. As I said earlier, check with your municipality, look at prior listing information, verify sources of information. That's key. I mean, so many of questions that Steph and I get 2 weeks before closing. where some of these surprises pop up and they really endanger the closing. If you took the extra time to go in and research that property, look at the history of the property, it is something that you owe to that client. Provide all material facts affecting the transaction, not just adverse. Check that the seller's real estate condition report matches information visual to agents, potential buyers. Real estate condition report must be fully completed. Every single question in there, every single item in there needs to be addressed. We've had a potential lawsuit because one of our agents forgot just one of those questions. Agents and firm will fulfill obligations and lawful requests that are written within the scope of the agency agreement. Liability is there if terms and conditions of the buyer agency agreement are not fulfilled, ignored, such as searching for sale by owners. I know a lot of agents exclude for sale by owners in their buyer agency agreement, saying to the buyer, listen, if you want to buy a for sale by owner, you're on your own. I'm not going to search for any, I'm not going to look up any, but if there's a particular one you see and you bring it to my attention, then it can be included in the buyer agency services. A lot of agents just write that into their BA that says all for sale by owners except for ones that the buyer brought to the agent. Negotiate for your client. It's your highest priority and highest value to your buyer. Agent will not place their interest ahead of the client's interest. That's the fiduciary duty. Okay. So I learned this a long time ago, and I think it's always been a great guide as a buyer's agent. These are three things that every buyer wants. They want the best negotiated price to their value of the property. They want the ease of process for the purchase. They trust their agent to make this smooth. You don't want to have your buyer all upset and stressed out because the thing is not, things getting wobbly and not processing easily. Buyers want their agent to take care of things in a sense. And number three, timely expected closing date to close on time, not all the delays. So if you keep that in the back of your mind, these are the three main things that every buyer wants. They don't want the lowest price. They want the best negotiated price to their value of the property. Work with the buyer on these goals. Okay. And again, the distinction of client versus customer, client is a party to the transaction who has an signed agency agreement with a broker for brokerage services, such as negotiations, comparative analysis, research into the property. A customer is party to a transaction who is provided brokerage services by a broker, but who is not a client, therefore cannot receive services such as negotiations, comparative analysis, research into the property. A customer can receive confidentiality, competent knowledge of the contracts and documents and all other services given to the parties. I had said earlier that you can do a CMA for a customer. And the distinction here is for a client, you do a CMA, but you explain all of the variations and the CMA. For a customer, you can do a CMA, but you just hand it to them. You know, this is what I came up with, close sold. But that's the difference there. So make sure you don't cross over any of these services, whether you're working with a customer or a client. Keep them separate. And as I said, use your vocabulary wisely. Call a client, call a customer. Don't call them all clients. And next one, I'm going to quickly get into the distinction on both the listing agreement and the buyer agency agreement, but is that explanation of multiple representation. And they want the buyer to be able to understand what multiple representation is, and then what it is with designated agency and what it is without designated agency. So I'm going to go over these explanations again. It's probably the most confusing issue with agents, not even necessarily new agents. But just to start, we're starting only within Keller Williams, and multiple representation is within the same company. So we're only talking about where we have a Keller Williams agent on both sides. So the buyer agency is technically with Keller Williams, and Keller Williams has a listing contract with the seller and a buyer agency agreement with the buyer, and both the buyer and seller are involved in the same transaction. That's what multiple representation is. Keller Williams is responsible for a client seller and a client buyer in the same transaction. That's multiple representation. So you can go on to the next slide. If you have designated agency in a multiple representation, then it means the client can receive, excuse me, each client can receive negotiation services from agents of Keller Williams who are not providing negotiation services to any other client of the broker company in that transaction. So designated agencies means that when you have multiple representation, both parties, buyer and seller, can receive fiduciary relationship with the agent by designated agents. So we have a designated agent for the seller, and we have a designated agent, all within Keller Williams, for the buyer. With the consent of each client involved in the transaction, one or more of the Keller Williams agents are designated to provide full service, information, opinions, and advice to the seller, client, and other agents from the Keller Williams are designated to provide full service information, opinions, advisor to the buyer client. So that means that we can give full representation, full negotiating services to the buyer and the seller within a Keller Williams transaction. So we have a Keller Williams agent on the list side, Keller Williams agent on the buy side, and they can work because of designated agency. So one of the choices in both the listing contract and the buyer agency contract is to choose what the buyer and choose what the seller really wants. So next slide. This is what it means to have by multiple representation, meaning Keller Williams is on both sides without designated agency. So if it's without designated agency, the form of multiple representation, where with the consent of each client involved in the transaction, the Keller Williams provides brokerage services to each party and gives information and advice. But the broker company, Keller Williams, and Keller Williams agents cannot place the interests of one client ahead of the other during negotiations, often sometimes referred to dual agency. That agent can only pass the paperwork back and forth between clients. In the listing and in the buyer agency agreement, both parties agree to the type of agency which agrees to or needs to be amended to agree. So they both have to agree and amend the agreement or amend the listing contract to make sure that they agree, meaning they both agree for designated agency or they both agree for no designated agency. When there's no designated agency, it means, as I said, you cannot act as a agent for that client. You have to just be neutral and pass the papers back and forth. So you lose your opportunity to really represent either that buyer or that seller. So the opportunist way to fill out those three choices is to agree to multiple representation and agree to multiple representation with designated agency. Therefore, we can continue to use Keller-Williams agents and in a Keller-Williams transaction. If you're still confused or in a situation where you're not sure, call us. We'll walk you through it anytime. So now what I want to do is just flip to the buyer agency agreement and look at it as a whole. But what I just covered were the important responsibilities that you need to that you need to follow. Okay. So I think most of you are aware of this. It's one of our main documents. It's one of the most used document outside of the offer to purchase and the listing agreement. This is a parallel agreement to the listing agreement. Pretty much what it is saying in a buyer agency agreement is, as I said, similar to a listing agreement with a seller. It's both a fiduciary relationship and it's something that belongs to Keller-Williams. Doesn't belong to you, the agent, exclusively. So that's what the word is, exclusive authority to act as the buyer's agent. That means that you are the only one that is servicing this buyer. And if the buyer has contact or previously contact with an owner, a firm, or the agents negotiating an acquisition of the interest in a property, and buyer's contact with those parties result in the firm not collecting full compensation under this agreement from the owner or the owner's agent, buyer shall be responsible to pay any uncollected amount. So in this contract, if we agree to compensation and you, the buyer's agent, don't get that full compensation from the seller or the seller's firm, the buyer is responsible to make up the difference. The next section is price range. I want to say that this is not a binding price range. We've had questions about this quite often. Just because you put in 1 to 1,000,000, or even if you put in 300,000 to 380,000 and made it specific, it is not binding. You can still sell them a house for 400,000 and it is still a binding agreement. So it's in there for determining the search parameters, but not necessarily, as I said, controls the outcome or controls the offer. Excluded properties, that's with any properties they may have seen with another agent or something, they are excluded and they should be put in there. So it's just like a listing where you have excluded buyers. In a buyer agency, we have excluded properties. And again, subject to prior agreement. If the buyer does not want this agreement to apply to properties subject to a prior agency agreement, buyers should identify such properties on lines 20 and 21. Buyer's failure to exclude from this agreement a property protected under a prior buyer agency agreement may result in the buyer owing commissions under each buyer agency agreement. So make sure that you explain this so well to your buyer and exclude properties that they saw with another buyer agency agreement. The compensation, the firm's compensation for purchase, option, exchange, the commission shall be 2.4%. That's negotiable. Don't forget that word with a capital N. That's negotiable. You can put down what you and the buyer are expecting to get as a buyer's agent. You can put it in lower, you can put in 2%, you can put it in higher, 3%. But it must match what the buyer does get. If the buyer is getting, say, puts in 2.4% in the buyer agency, but the seller in the offer that they've written is only offering 2%, this buyer agency agreement needs to be amended to 2%. They have to agree on both sides. It cannot be higher than what they're getting from the seller in a contract. Going on all the things about the commission, how it's calculated, other compensation, whether you're charging a buyer agency fee or not, has to be discussed with the buyer and in agreement with the buyer. Okay. You can be paid by the owner or the owner's agent. Firm is hereby authorized to seek payment of commission from the owner, which is actually the seller, or the owner's agent, the listing firm, as through compensation agreements, provided that all parties in the transaction give prior written consent. Buyer shall pay the firm's compensation reduced by any amount the firm receives from the owner or the owner's agent. So again, they're saying the buyer has to make up any difference to the positive of what they've agreed to and what the firm is actually getting. What you need to do about the earnest money, the firm's duties, to use professional knowledge and skills, reasonable efforts within the scope of Wisconsin Statute, Chapter 452. If you're not, that's where you might get a complaint from the other side, either from the actual buyer or seller from the other side or from the other agent. A complaint that you may have violated some ability, any ethics, all of that can be called in and complained, and you have to go there and explain your position. So that's where we have to be very careful about what we are doing with our clients and also with the other agent in the transaction. And again, it goes through, as I said, the disclosure to clients. This is what you disclose to them. You disclose to all parties, lines 181, lines 81 through 91. And then because you have entered into a client relationship, you have these additional duties that you owe to you as a client. So those additional duties of lines 94 through lines 104 are what I had in the previous slide presentation. Make sure that you remember that. Make sure you will not place your interests ahead of the client's interests. And then they go through to explain what I went through is multiple representation, and then with designated agency and without designated agency. We think the most opportune choice is the first one, where you agree to multiple representation. Of course, both agents are in Keller Williams, and that you also agree to designated agency if there's any kind of a conflict. So that is explained again. It explains talking about subagency, your confidentiality. A lot of people sort of skip this and don't put in what they want confidential, but your client can explain to what they want confidential, say they're about to get a divorce or things like that. But most people don't even write it down. They just trust their agent. We talk about discrimination, non-discrimination, dispute resolution. That's what your obligation is on how to dispute any breach or issue with the transaction, either with the parties or with the agents. Making sure that this came up in a transaction I had under 180 to 183. Property dimensions. The buyer was trying to go after the seller and my firm because it turned out that the property dimensions were not correct or exact. And we had to go back to him and show him line 183 to 184, saying buyer should verify any property dimensions or total square footage acreage calculation, which is material to the buyer. And that's what released us from that potential lawsuit. And then they define adverse fact and all of these terms that we are dealing with in a transaction with a buyer client. What a lien notice is, termination of the agreement. Please make sure that you read that and then call Steph for me. You can extend the agreement term. What's your responsibilities and delivery of documents and written notices. And then you put in the actual email address for the buyer, and that's the buyer's agent, and for the seller, and that's the listing agent. And then any additional provisions that you want to work into the contract. It's important that dot, dot, dot. And you can write them in this spot. Any addendum that are attached, you identify them on this sheet. And then you have the term of the contract, and make sure the term of the contract is from that date to that date. That's on lines 288 to 289. Not the date that the client signed this, but the date of the terms of the agreement. Okay. A little bit about wire fraud, but that's the buyer agency agreement and the obligations that you have if you are getting into a buyer agency agreement. It's be very careful on making sure that you are always aware, you're always in contact with your client. Don't abandon them, don't disregard them. Please communicate with them ear to ear, voice to ear, as much as possible. And have an agreement between your client and you about how you want to be communicated with. Do you like text? Can I call you every once in a while? On important matters, I do want to call you and I want to be able to talk to you. So I don't want to do this whole transaction via text or email. I want to be able to have a possibility when it is important. I will present all offers to you in person. Things like that. I think you want to make sure that this relationship is special. You are going above and beyond being a realtor for a buyer. You are being a fiduciary, responsible agent that can actually get things done and be rewarded with a nice closing at the end. So, are there any questions? This was sort of a basic buyer agency response, but something that we all have to keep in mind, even if you've been practicing real estate for a long time.
Hey, this
That
is
was
Uma.
excellent, Joan. Thank you. But go ahead, Uma.
How do we verify the things like if where to find like the actual school district or if there is any easement, something like that, or the exact measurements? Measurements like you can go in actually check it, but how to find out the other things?
Yeah, you can go into the municipality either online or physically go in. You want to probably zero in on the tax assessor because that's the person that knows those questions, knows those answers, I should say.
So you send an email to the municipality or the county
Yeah,
where
if you go into the municipality's website and they have different places where you can ask questions, you can chat with them, you can do things like that. If it's City of Milwaukee, I would suggest going online. If it's Mequon or Fox Point, I would really suggest going there to the municipality. They can talk to you directly. They can show you plats, information that you might need. But I think it's an important step if you're going to start working with a buyer. You don't have to do it for every house they looked at, but for a house that they're prepared to write an offer on, I would do it before they write the offer. Make sure that they know all of the secrets of this property.
Okay. So the plat map will also give the exact boundaries of that lot.
It depends on the municipality. Some do, some don't. Places that have a grid-like development, like in Whitefish Bay, you've got lots that are all this size and houses that are all basically this size. Those are pretty easy to determine the dimensions. But when you have irregular lots like in River Hills where they have 5 acres or something, you're not going to get an established plat of that lot. You're going to have to use the tax information to see basically what they say. If it's a house in a subdivision, they don't have surveys of the lots, but they have plats of the lots. So you're able to see exactly the dimensions of a subdivision house. But anything else older or more varied, places by the river, places by the lake, you're going to have to calculate the lot size based on the formula that MLS has for you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other good questions? Okay. Well, if you're going to be a buyer's agent, be a good buyer's agent.